I never expected that buying a home in a quiet, retirement-friendly neighborhood would lead to a local soap opera, literally. It began innocently enough. I found a house with a decent-sized yard, a modest swimming pool, and plenty of sunshine. Perfect, I thought, for Sunday barbecues with my grown children and their kids when they visited. Plus, the neighborhood association boasted about being well-maintained and secure, just what I needed at my age. I didn't realize secure was code for micromanaged by the local busybody, who would soon become my personal nemesis. Her name was Karen. And trust me, I try not to stereotype, but this woman embodied every dreaded quality one associates with that label. Relentless chatter, unsolicited opinions, an eagle-eyed watchfulness over every blade of grass, and a certain skill for complicating other people's lives. Even her posture screamed disapproval. Arms forever folded across her chest, lips permanently pursed, eyes narrow like a hawk zeroing in on a wounded rabbit. She was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association and, apparently, the world. The first time I crossed paths with her was a week after I moved in. I was carefully unboxing some old lawn furniture out of my driveway when she walked up, clipboard under her arm, wearing a visor that might have been in style 30 years ago. She said, "You're the new neighbor, aren't you?" Like it was an accusation. I forced a smile and confirmed it, politely offering my name. She paused, looked me up and down, then grunted something about the guidelines for furniture storage. Right off the bat, there was friction. I suppose I should have recognized the spark that was about to become a flame. Since my retirement, I've taken up a routine. Morning coffee by the pool, a brisk walk around the block, then yard work before the mid-afternoon heat. Karen took issue with my lawn ornaments, not in keeping with neighborhood standards. My preference for planting a wildflower corner near the fence. This is not a commune for bugs. And even my mailbox color, which, in fairness, was a slightly unconventional burnt orange. Yet, each time she reprimanded me, I complied or negotiated. I wanted peace. I wanted to coexist. That was my mistake. Perhaps showing the slightest hint of compliance only fueled her sense of control. The trouble with the pool started after a seemingly minor incident. The association had a rule that all pools needed to be visually unobtrusive. I guess you're supposed to have a neutral-colored privacy fence, keep the water pristine, and ensure no boisterous pool parties. Easy enough. But I decided to install a few solar-powered floating lights, so I could enjoy a late-night dip without harsh floodlights. They were subtle, glowing orbs that changed color from a calming green to a gentle amber. They looked magical at night. However, when Karen spotted them bobbing around after dark, she decided I was violating her notion of visual harmony. 3 days later, I woke up early to check on the pool's chemical levels. From my bedroom window, I noticed that something seemed off. My normally clear blue water was covered in a layer of foam, like I'd overfilled a dishwasher. The closer I got, the more pungent the smell, a perfumed floral detergent odor. My eyes watered, and I could practically taste the soap in the air. I was shocked. Who would do this? Then I remembered the color of my lights, the annoyance on Karen's face whenever I so much as blinked in her presence, and I had a pretty solid guess. I briefly considered that it might have been prank-happy teenagers or some bored college kids on break. But the more I mulled it over, the more certain I became. For one thing, the neighborhood kids rarely ventured onto my property, especially with that hawk-like neighbor always looming. For another, the sabotage was too specific. You'd have to know precisely where the pool pump was, how to lift the skimmer lid, and which detergent was potent enough to produce that kind of foamy madness. And there was no sign of forced entry. It was the work of someone who'd studied the layout, who was confident enough to tamper with the pool in the middle of the night, and who held a personal grudge. While I sat there flabbergasted, the foam rose and churned, creeping over the edges. The sight was so absurd, I burst into laughter. It didn't help that I was standing on my patio in mismatched pajamas and slippers. If any onlooker saw me, they'd think I'd gone a bit loopy, cackling at dawn over a foamy pool. But that mix of anger and surreal humor boiled in my chest. A neighbor's bark cut through the quiet morning. I heard the rumble of an engine from the next block over. Life was starting in the neighborhood, while my new day started with a big, dramatic soap bubble fiasco. I wasn't about to let Karen see me defeated. Gathering my composure, I marched into my garage to find the tools necessary to drain and clean the pool. My intention was simply to flush out the soap, treat the water, and carry on. But as is often the case, a little frustration and a hint of pettiness can lead to monumental decisions. I thought, if she wants soap, I'll show her soap. Not even sure what that meant yet. Even though I tried to keep a level head, I was still seething. And I had no idea just how extreme the next steps would become. The rest of that morning was spent strategizing. It wasn't just a matter of clearing out suds. The foamy soup lapping at the edges of my pool was thick enough to star in a bubble bath commercial. Typically, if you get soap in a pool, you can skim off the top, let the filter system do its job, and neutralize the detergent with chemicals over time. But this wasn't a mild accident. My water looked like a cappuccino. The amount of soap was so massive, the entire filter system threatened to clog. The pump whined ominously, and I couldn't let it run without risking permanent damage. A local handyman I'd befriended at the community center suggested I do a partial drain. Just open the drainage valve, let the water run off into the sewage lines, he told me. That should lower the water enough to flush out all the foam. That made sense. But here's the catch. I discovered the previous homeowner had installed a drainage system that was a bit unorthodox. When I climbed behind the hedges to look at the external pipe, I realized the water would flood out onto the side yard, which was slightly sloped, leading directly toward Karen's property. Under normal circumstances, a simple pool drain might not cause a torrent. But my pool was large, nearly Olympic-sized by suburban standards. If I just flipped the switch, the combined water and soap might pour right into her hydrangeas. Was it petty of me to consider letting that happen? You bet. But I was still fuming, my blood running hotter by the second every time I inhaled that sugary, soapy smell. Rationally, I understood there could be legal ramifications, some HOA rule about water disposal, or environmental concerns. However, in that heated moment, all I pictured was Karen sneaking around in the night with a giant jug of cheap bubble bath, cackling as she poured it in. That mental image pretty much annihilated my reservations. Still, I didn't want to jump into a fiasco that'd land me in a lawsuit. So I tried to call the HOA helpline that morning, but it went straight to voicemail. Next, I texted the few neighbors I'd grown friendly with, explaining the situation. Some offered sympathy, but they also told me that going against Karen, who had the ear of the HOA board, could be more trouble than it was worth. My frustration only increased. Why was everyone so intimidated? Was she that powerful? I considered confronting Karen directly. I even walked down the sidewalk to her place, ignoring the silent watchers behind their curtains. Karen's front yard was impeccably trimmed, with a weirdly symmetrical display of plastic flamingos. By the time I got there, though, I chickened out. She was sitting on her porch, arms crossed, glaring with that same hawkish intensity. Without a shred of preamble, she shouted, "Keep your property in line, or I'll write you up again." I lost my nerve, because at that moment, I realized I wasn't in the mood for a fruitless confrontation. I wanted justice, and maybe a little comedic revenge. So I just turned around and headed home. As fate would have it, the day got blazing hot, baking that soapy mess, turning it into a sticky, frothy residue along the edges. A summer storm threatened in the afternoon, dark clouds rolling in, but it never fully broke. That left me with a bizarre half-day of heavy humidity, swirling foam, and a faint drizzle that only heightened the bubble production. When I stepped into the backyard, it looked like a cheap amusement park's foam party, minus the dancing teenagers. By late afternoon, I'd had enough. I turned off the pump entirely, drained off a fraction of the water, and tried to corral the froth with a net. But the net got tangled, and I nearly fell headfirst into the swirling mess. That near fall must have snapped something inside me. I decided, maybe in a moment of comedic mania, that if Karen wanted to meddle in my pool business, I'd give her the biggest, soapiest show of her life. I marched over to the drainage valve. My only plan was to let some of the water out, hopefully onto my own lawn if possible. I'd keep a watchful eye so it wouldn't overflow too far. But nature, as always, had other ideas. The slope of the land was more pronounced than I realized, and the recent drizzle had left the ground waterlogged. The moment I cracked the valve and the water started flowing, a force seemed to suck it straight downward, funneling the soapy torrent off to the side and beyond my fence. I panicked, racing around the backyard to see if there was any way to redirect it. Then, I heard a muffled squeal, like someone stepped on a wet dog toy. I peered over the fence line and saw it. A growing sea of foam creeping across Karen's immaculate lawn. And let me tell you, the sight was bizarrely mesmerizing, like something from a cartoon. My heart pounded. I was both horrified and, I admit, a bit enthralled by the spectacle. In real time, I was seeing this unstoppable wave of bubbles devour her perfectly manicured flower beds. Within seconds, her pink plastic flamingos were half submerged in milky froth. It was the comedic irony of the century. I tried to close the valve, but a burst of soapy water had made the handle slippery. It spun in my grasp, refusing to budge. Meanwhile, the entire contraption was shaking with the pressure of thousands of gallons draining. I realized I might have to run inside to shut the main breaker for the pump or something more drastic, but the comedic show in front of me rooted me to the spot. Was I proud in that moment? I'd be lying if I said I wasn't snickering behind a hand pressed to my mouth. It felt wrong, but also felt, well, like the universe was dishing out some well-timed karma. For a moment, I basked in that twisted satisfaction. I didn't consider the consequences, the potential damage, or the fury that was undoubtedly about to be unleashed. All I could do was watch foam swirl and billow, creeping closer and closer to Karen's house. It wasn't long before the commotion drew curious onlookers. Mr. Mendez, who lived 2 doors down and usually kept to himself, stepped outside to see what all the racket was about. A couple walking their dogs paused on the sidewalk, gawking at the spectacle of a lawn turning into a giant bubble bath. I imagine it's not every day one sees a foamy avalanche rolling across well-trimmed suburban grass. They must have stood there, slack-jawed, for a good minute before the woman mumbled something inaudible, tugging her dogs along. Then I caught sight of Karen herself. She stormed out of her front door like a tornado in a floral blouse. Her mouth opened, but any shout she might have uttered was muffled by the thick layer of soap. She tried stepping into the yard, big mistake. Instantly, her feet slipped on the slick surface, and she fell backwards, disappearing into the suds. Somewhere in the background, I heard Mr. Mendez exclaim, "Dios mío," whether in shock or suppressed laughter, I couldn't tell. At this point, I managed to wrestle the valve handle back into position and shut off the flow. But enough water had already escaped to ensure Karen's entire yard was saturated. Bubbles frothed around her ankles, the sidewalk, and even the public curb. I half expected to see car, tires spinning out, but mercifully no one was driving by right at that moment. I stared at the aftermath in disbelief. An ocean of foam dotted with soggy flamingos, drenched flower beds, and a sputtering Karen who was trying to stand while coated in white suds from head to toe. Now, if I had any sense of self-preservation, I would have hightailed it indoors and prayed for a time machine. Instead, I hopped the low fence dividing our properties, extended a hand, mostly in reflex, partially in guilt, and asked if she was okay. Karen slapped my hand away, scrambled to her feet, and launched into a tirade. It was something about lawsuits, environmental damage, and moral depravity. Somewhere in that frothy haze, I heard her vow, "I will make your life miserable," which felt contradictory, given she'd already been working on that for months. I tried explaining myself, how it was an accident, how I never intended for it to flood her yard. But let's be honest, with a grin plastered on my face, I was failing miserably at hiding the absurd humor of it all. Karen wasn't buying a single word. Her glare could have cut steel. She threatened to call the HOA board, the city inspector, and potentially the local news station for environmental harassment. Though the last threat sounded more comedic than menacing, I knew I was in hot water, pun fully intended. "Don't think this is over," Karen spat, stomping back into her house. She left a trail of bubbles in her wake, each step squeaking against the driveway. For a moment, I stood there, knee-deep in her foamy lawn, unsure whether to laugh or cry. That's when I noticed the small audience that had gathered on the sidewalk. Some wore expressions of shock, a few were clearly amused, and one older woman actually applauded. Then they all dispersed, as if a silent agreement had been reached. We've had our entertainment for the day. I walked back home, shoulders heavy with the knowledge that I'd possibly escalated a neighborly feud into a full-blown war. Still, there was a part of me that felt validated. Karen had inflicted sabotage on my property, and now she'd tasted a bit of the chaos herself. Maybe in a twisted way, it would make her think twice about messing with other folks. Or maybe not. Knowing her, it might have the opposite effect, spurring her to double down on her brand of tyranny. By early evening, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. I hopped online to check the HOA rules about water disposal, property damage, and any mention of Suds infiltration, just in case. Nothing directly covered the situation. It felt like uncharted territory. The labyrinth of municipal codes left me even more confused. I decided I'd try to get some rest and prepare for whatever fresh chaos the morning might bring. Fate, however, had other ideas. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud truck idling outside. Peering out the window, I saw an official-looking vehicle with a large tank on the back, presumably for pumping water or cleaning up spills. Two men in reflective vests hopped out, shining flashlights around the street. One tapped my doorbell, sending a shrill ring through the house. I stumbled downstairs to answer. "We got a complaint of a hazardous materials spill," said the older man, glancing down at a clipboard. "Something about detergent contamination." Next to him, the younger man nodded gravely, as though we were discussing a major chemical leak. I nearly burst out laughing at the notion that my pool fiasco was being treated like a catastrophic event. I explained what happened: a malicious soap dump in my pool, an accidental drainage mishap, and an unsuspecting neighbor's yard. They scratched their heads, scribbled notes, and did a quick inspection of the property lines. It was all very formal for something so silly. In the end, they concluded it was more of a petty vandalism and comedic meltdown than a hazardous incident. But they noted that neighbors had complained about excessive foam runoff. One guess who that might have been. They left me with a stern, "make sure it doesn't happen again," as if it were entirely under my control. Shutting my front door, I chuckled at the absurdity of it all. That's when I saw the second note from Karen tucked under my welcome mat, presumably left there while I was talking to the officials. It read, in scrawling capital letters, "You will pay." Short, ominous, and definitely not the hallmark sentiment I wanted. Suddenly, my comedic triumph felt a lot more like a ticking time bomb. The next morning, I awoke to a barrage of notifications on my phone. Word had spread quickly. Neighbors texted me gossip, a few photo messages of Karen's sudsy yard, and at least one short video showing her slipping in the foam. The text read, "Best Saturday night entertainment ever." It turned my stomach. Sure, I had found it amusing in the moment, but I had no desire to publicly humiliate anyone. The video felt like a cringeworthy reminder that our spat had become the neighborhood's reality show. To make matters worse, the HOA board sent an email summoning me to a mediation session. Great, I thought. I get to sit in a stuffy conference room and endure Karen's shrill claims while some board official tries to keep the peace. My instincts told me this was going to be a fiasco, but I had no choice. Ignoring it would only bolster Karen's case that I was some rogue neighbor running a bubble empire. When I arrived at the HOA's small office next to the community clubhouse, Karen was already there, perched on a plastic chair like a disgruntled parrot. Her arms were folded, her lips pressed into a stern line. The board members, 2 men and 1 woman, each wearing business casual attire, gestured for me to sit. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, cleared her throat and asked Karen to present her concerns. Karen launched into a dramatic saga about unhinged neighbors, illegal chemical disposal, and personal endangerment. She claimed I deliberately sabotaged her property with no concern for safety. She even brandished photos of her soapy hydrangeas, each flower drooping under the weight of the foam. I kept my face neutral, though part of me wanted to laugh at how she described the scene like it was a major ecological disaster. Margaret then turned to me. In as calm a tone as I could muster, I explained how the entire issue began with Karen sneaking onto my property and dumping soap into my pool in the dead of night. I admitted to draining the water, but insisted the flooding onto Karen's lawn was an accident, exacerbated by the slope of the land and the drainage setup. I have no intention of harming anyone's property, I said, leveling Karen with a firm stare. But I do have a right to protect my home from vandalism. A tense hush fell over the room. One of the men on the board, Mr. Fenton, asked if I had any proof that Karen was the culprit. My heart sank. Despite every fiber of my being believing Karen did it, I had no security footage or eyewitness testimony. Karen seized on that, her voice crackling with mock outrage. Accusing me without proof? Appalling. She pressed a hand to her chest, as though deeply wounded. We went around in circles for nearly an hour. Finally, Margaret rubbed her temples and said, "What we have here is a dispute that's turned personal. Without evidence, the board can't discipline Ms. Karen for the alleged vandalism. However, we do note that Mr. ______'s drainage of pool water onto another property is a violation of Section 14B. The group debated potential fines, the standard restitution for property damage, and mandatory changes to my drainage system." Karen's eyes glittered with triumph. But then a small twist emerged. Margaret, flipping through a manila folder, said in a slow, measured tone, "There's one more thing. We've received additional complaints from other homeowners about Ms. Karen's persistent, unauthorized visits to their properties. They mention missing items, tampered lawn decor, and intrusive behavior." She angled her gaze at Karen. "That, too, is against association guidelines, and it's subject to investigation." Karen's face paled. She sputtered, "Nonsense. These are malicious rumors." But the board's expression had shifted, like they'd seen or heard enough from other neighbors to suspect Karen was indeed crossing lines. For a moment, the tables tilted in my favor. Margaret closed the folder, concluding that both parties would be monitored. I was slapped with a hefty fine for improper water disposal. But Karen was warned that if any proof emerged of her trespassing or vandalizing property, she'd face serious consequences. I left that meeting feeling mixed relief and resentment. I'd have to pay a couple $100s for the meltdown, but at least Karen's hold on the community might be weakened. I also vowed to myself, enough is enough. If Karen wanted to keep playing dirty, I'd protect myself properly. That afternoon, I installed a few discreet security cameras around my perimeter, all pointed at my pool area, side gate, and driveway. I shared the situation with a few other neighbors who were fed up with her antics. We formed a small alliance, promising to watch out for each other and document any suspicious behavior. For a week, nothing happened. The soap eventually dissipated, my pool got back in shape, and Karen steered clear of me, though she made a show of glaring whenever we crossed paths on the sidewalk. Word spread about the fiasco, and people mostly found it hilarious, especially with no major damage done aside from Karen's bruised pride and a few burnt-out flowers. Life, for a glorious moment, seemed stable. But one morning, a neighbor texted me at sunrise, "Check your yard. Something's up." Heart pounding, I hurried outside. There, on my lawn, a comically large "for sale" sign stood, made of cheap cardboard and scrawled marker. Beneath the words, "Get out," was a horrifyingly accurate caricature of me being chased by soap suds. I couldn't prove it was Karen's doing, but come on. Who else had the motivation to pull such a stunt? I sighed, grabbed the sign, and tossed it in the trash. Cameras would have recorded it, so I checked the footage. Sure enough, right around 3 a.m., a hooded figure sneaked up and planted the sign. They were careful to keep their back to the camera, so no face was visible. But the posture, that shape of the shoulders, I was pretty sure I recognized it. I printed screenshots, emailed them to the board, and asked if they'd like to see any more unauthorized visits. A few days later, a notice went out to the entire neighborhood from the HOA, reminding all residents that trespassing, vandalism, and harassment would not be tolerated. The letter's stern wording and explicit mention of exterior property signage or sabotage was a direct shot at Karen. I took it as a small victory, though I suspected the war wasn't over. In a bizarre twist, the fiasco turned me into a minor hero among certain neighbors, those who'd been bullied by Karen for years and never stood up to her. They offered me homemade cookies, phone numbers, even invites to card games at the community center. I realized I'd inadvertently done something positive. I'd exposed Karen's bullying in a way that was impossible for her to hide. Sure, a soap flood wasn't the method I'd have chosen in an ideal world. But life has a funny way of shaping stories. In the end, the fiasco taught me an unlikely lesson about standing my ground, even at my age. Sometimes you do everything by the book, yet bullies persist. Then the universe steps in with a comedic curveball, like a soapy flood rolling onto the villain's lawn, and suddenly the playing field feels a bit more even. I decided that from now on, I wouldn't tiptoe around Karen's antics. I'd live peacefully in my home, keep my pool lights and my wildflowers, and hold my head high. If she snuck in with detergent again, I'd have the footage. And if I ever needed to drain my pool, you can bet I'd do it carefully, but also with just enough satisfaction to remember the day the soap bubbles took over her perfect lawn. Because sometimes, even in a stifling HOA community, poetic justice has a whimsical way of bursting forth, like foam rising from the depths of a quiet suburban pool, unstoppable and sparkling in the sunlight. And who knows, maybe Karen will eventually learn the same lesson. But if not, well, at least I've got a front row seat to the most dramatic neighborhood show in town. The end.